Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rica Juntilo, and I'm a licensed psychologist and an instructor at Xavier University at Ateneo de Cagayan. I also graduated in the same school for my master's degree. So this afternoon, I will be looking into or talking about my paper entitled Locus of Hope and Learned Helplessness Among Filipino Adults Belonging in Poverty-Stricken Communities. So this is my presentation outline. I will be looking into the construct definition, the research question, methods, results and discussion, conclusions, and the references of my study. Poverty in the Philippines has been one of the most prevalent social issues that are being explored here in the Philippines. So this is supported by the 2014 data of the Philippine Statistics Authority, stating that poverty incidence in the country is around 25.8% of the population. So the indicators used to measure poverty incidence were from the Family Income and Expenditure Survey that looks into the minimum income required in meeting basic food and non-food needs like clothing, housing, transportation, health, and educational expenses. So these reflect that poverty is characterized by material deprivation. Yet, it is also important to note that in the experience of poverty, the psychological aspect plays a crucial role also in understanding this experience. So for this study, what I looked into as the main theory is Lewis's culture of poverty. So he defined culture of poverty as a system comprised of four principal dimensions, namely the relationship between the subculture and the larger society. This is the political aspect. And then the nature of the slum community, which is the social cultural aspect, and the nature of the family, which is the social aspect, and the attitude, values, and character structure of the individual, which is the psychological aspect or psychological side. So the last dimension is the primary focus of this study. So I looked into the psychological aspect, specifically the experience of learned helplessness and locus of hope in relation to poverty among Filipinos belonging in poverty-stricken communities. So the two constructs that I looked into were locus of hope and learned helplessness. So what you can see in the screen is the operational definition of the constructs that I looked into. So the research question for this study is, does locus of hope, internal, external family, external peers, and external spiritual, significantly predict learned helplessness among Filipino adults belonging in poverty-stricken communities? So the respondents of the study were the recipients of the community education program of the German Doctors Community and Moresco 1, which was a corporate social responsibility program geared towards providing education and awareness to selected communities under their coverage area. So this is in terms of health, poverty, environment, and other social and relevant issues like poverty alleviation. So the recipients were also subsidized by the government's Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, or the 4Ps, which is a program by the Philippine government that financially subsidizes families whose monthly income is below 10,000 pesos, of which reflects those Filipinos living in poverty and or relocation programs. So there are 200 respondents in this study, and I looked into the age, gender, and marital status, and I considered it as part of establishing the profile of the respondents. So in terms of the respondents' age distribution, most of the respondents were around 40 years of age with a standard deviation of 11, and around 95% or around 190 of the respondents were female. And as to the marital status of the respondents, more than half, or around 77.5%, or 155 of the respondents were married. So the sampling procedure used to select the respondents from the two respective communities was simple random sampling, and it was conducted by getting the highest list of attendees for each community based on their respective class sessions, and names from the said list were randomly selected via the raffle draw. So in terms of the reliability and validity of the study, you can see here in the table that both tools use the locus of hope questionnaire and the new attributional style questionnaire, which was used for the learned helplessness scale, were all reliable and valid. So this table shows a summary of the correlation of the variables of the study. So it shows here that locus of hope or the locus of hope dimensions are weakly correlated to learned helplessness. So implying that although such variables exist among these poverty-stricken communities, the predictive relationship of the two is not significant. So this table, on the other hand, shows the cross-validation or tabulation of the variables of the study. So we see here that the locus of hope dimensions or the profile of the respondents were around the same, whether they reported to have experienced learned helplessness or not. So this implies that regardless if the respondents experienced learned helplessness or not, the four locus of hope dimensions still exist and were also relatively similar in terms of both types of respondents. So for the external family locus of hope dimensions, was also relatively high for both types of respondents as compared to the other dimensions, especially in relation to the external peers and external spiritual locus of hope dimension, which was relatively low still for both types of respondents. So this table, on the other hand, shows the multiple regression analysis performed in order to check the main hypothesis of the study. So you can see here that none of the locus of hope dimensions, the internal, external family, external peers, and external spiritual, which was the independent variable of the study, significantly predicted the dependent variable of the study, which was learned helplessness. So the model shows here that only 5% of the experience or in the experience of learned helplessness can be explained by a person's locus of hope. So the beta coefficients also imply that locus of hope was not a predictor of learned helplessness among Filipino adults belonging in poverty-stricken communities, as shown also in their respective p-values obtained from the regression analysis that were also not significant. So some of the conclusions that we can draw from the findings and discussion is that although locus of hope, namely the internal, external family, external peers, and external spiritual, and learned helplessness collectively exist among these poverty-stricken communities, they do not significantly relate to each other, as locus of hope only explains around 5% of the variation in the experience of learned helplessness. Another conclusion is that the remaining 95% that may have significantly contributed in explaining the experience of learned helplessness may be due to the other factors, which may be from the programs implemented, like the community education and the 4Ps, the program, in these poverty-stricken communities. So in relation to that, the third conclusion is that the findings or these findings also support Lewis's culture of poverty theory, in that although looking into the psychological aspects such as the locus of hope and learned helplessness of the experience of poverty is important in understanding how these poverty-stricken communities cope up with such an experience, so as the other aspects, or so are the other aspects, such as the political, sociocultural, and the social aspect that were also emphasized or mentioned in Lewis's culture of poverty. So the last finding and or conclusion drawn from the present study looked into giving more emphasis or importance or the value of research in order to understand, verify, and substantiate observations, existing knowledge, and or issues that may explain the profile, dynamics, and the nature of the community, which in this context, or in the context of the study, pertains to the psychological aspect of the experience of poverty. So again, in the study, I only looked into the experience of hope and learned helplessness for the psychological aspect of the experience of poverty. So here are my references.